Well, good morning, everybody. We are continuing in our overview. We're walking our way right through the Bible, and we're doing an overview of each book. And this morning, we find ourselves at the last book of the historical library in our Old Testament. So we are concluding this section with the book of Esther, the book of Esther. Now, we're going to take a little bit of time in Esther. In fact, I'm going to have this to be a two-parter. So this Sunday, and Lord willing, next Sunday, we'll be talking about Esther, and there's a reason for that. And that is because I'm going to tie this together next Sunday. But we're going to go over to Ezekiel next Sunday, and we're going to look at Ezekiel 38 and 39, which is where we find this prophecy concerning something that's very popular today about Gog and Magog. It's mentioned again in the book of Revelation, and I'm going to make the case next Sunday that Gog and Magog in that prophecy was fulfilled during the time period of the book of Esther. But I'm not able to make that case unless you know the book of Esther, at least the story, pretty well. And so this morning, we're going to do this a little bit different than how you've heard me teach the overview so far. I'm going to quickly go over some of these things because you're going to hear me reiterate them a bunch, and then we're going to dive into the actual story of Esther and go through each chapter. So if you have your Bible this morning, I encourage you to have it open because we're going to do a survey of these chapters, and it will be helpful if you have your Bible open to see them. For those of you who are joining us online, good morning to you, and we're so thankful that you're joining us. We consider you to be a part of our online congregation, and we're so glad that you're joining us. We're all following a handout this morning. In fact, it's a two-pager this morning for Esther. You can get these online if you sign up for our newsletter. We email these out before the Sunday services each week. If you've already signed up for our newsletter, check your inbox. You have this in there, and you can see what folks have on their handout this morning. So let's go ahead and jump into the book of Esther. Let me give you a couple of preliminary things. First of all, the word Esther, the name Esther, is the central figure of this story. Her name means star. She's the queen of Persia. But she actually is a Jew, which she hides her identity for most of the book, and we'll see why a little bit later. Her Hebrew name, we learn, is Hadassah, which means myrtle, the tree, myrtle. Now, this is a slow-growing tree. It's a tree that can survive harsh environments. And also, even when they're in the wild, myrtles appear to be pruned. They're very beautiful. If you get to the book of Zechariah, chapter 1 and verses 8 through 11, the myrtle is used to show God's presence among his people. So very interesting if you want to do a word study on myrtle. That's her Hebrew name. Very interesting also that many people have noted that a blossom of this particular tree does resemble a star, which is ironic because that's the meaning of Esther. So the kind of a word play going on there. You can look at that on your own. This is book number 17 of 39 in the Old Testament, but really don't let that throw you, because what I really, really want you to know this morning as a smart and educated Bible student is this. This is the last book of the history section. So put a nice bow on that. You know, you have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, 5 books of the Pentateuch volumes, 5 volumes. The Greek word Pentateuch means 5 volumes. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, 5 volumes. Also known as the Torah, which means law, Hebrew word for law, and the law of Moses. All of those are the first 5 books. Then we start a new section. So in your mind, these are libraries you're taking off your shelf. And the next library is called the historical section. And those are going to go all the way from, we're talking about the history of Israel, all the way from before Saul as the first king and all the way to the end of the Old Testament. So these are the historical books. It covers all the times of Joshua going into the promised land, the judges, the 400 years of the cycle of the judges, on to King Saul, King David, Solomon, divided kingdom. We are going to see the northern tribes, the 10 tribes, taken away in the captivity by Assyria, and then the southern 2 taken away in captivity by Babylon. They're going to be in Babylon for 70 years and return back to the land. They're going to rebuild the temple and the wall. And during that time, Esther is in Persia at the time of the rebuilding of Ezra and Nehemiah. And at that time, we're getting to the end of the Old Testament, chronologically speaking. So Esther is going on in between. Actually, I'll be very precise with you. If you look down here, I have the time period as 483 to 472. And I'll just say it this way. The timeline of the book of Esther may be placed between Ezra 6 and Ezra 7. It's very specific. How do we know that? Because Zerubbabel finished up the temple already, and Ezra was making his way and arriving in Jerusalem in that next wave. It's during that time period that, and how do we know that? Because we're given the years of the reigns of the kings. If you want to spend the time to do that, that's how people put it on the timeline. So just so you know, so right now when you're reading at the end of Malachi, at the end of the Old Testament, and you're getting ready for that intertestamental period of 400 silent years waiting for Matthew and Jesus' birth, we're at that point. This is contemporary with Malachi. So this is the end of that story. So that means that when Ezekiel is prophesying about Gog and Magog, Ezekiel, although it's later in your Bible, Ezekiel is prophesying that is before Esther happens. So Esther is after Ezekiel. So this is the end of the Old Testament right here. It's the end of those history books. So if you can learn that this morning, it's worth the price of admission. That right there is worth it, right there. It doesn't cost anything, but it's worth it, okay? So here's a little visual to explain this. So here, of course, we have history. So this is what you want to look at for your library of the history of Israel, those 12. So we're at the end of it, so that means we're at the end of this history. This is the Old Testament. So yes, that means that Malachi is contemporary with Esther. They're happening at the same time. Okay? So that means when we get into the poetry wisdom, we're going to start fitting this in. So think about it this way. Every column that we do from now on, let's just take the poetry section. I'm going to be able to take these, and I'm going to be able to show you on this half of the screen where these fit in. So Job is a contemporary with Genesis in the patriarchal period. Psalms is made up of a variety of things, but mostly it's King David, some Solomon. So these are going to go here. Proverbs is Solomon. Ecclesiastes is Solomon. Song of Solomon. So we're going to be able to take these, and they're going to go someplace that way because that's the end of the story. Does that start to make sense? It's sort of like the book of Acts. When you realize Acts is 35 years or 40 years after the ascension of Christ, then I can go into 1 Corinthians and I can go back to Acts and see where in Acts was 1 Corinthians written. Acts becomes my timeline of the New Testament. Just like that, this becomes the timeline of your Old Testament, and these will all fit somewhere in here. So if you get that in your head, you're ahead of the game. Okay? All right, I spent more time on that than I wanted to. What we're going to do the rest of the time is I'm going to go chapter by chapter and tell you one of the greatest stories you've ever heard. This is absolutely, if you had a screenwriter, this story right here, it sounds like somebody wrote a fantasy novel. It is so amazing. I can't wait to show you this story. Let's get into it. This is the synopsis of chapter 1. Chapter 1 starts with the book of Esther, and it records the story about how Ahasuerus, which is also Xerxes the first, but from here on out, we're just going to call him Ahasuerus. Ahasuerus attempted to show off his wife. So let me just explain this. This guy had a 180-day-long party where people from the kingdom could come and get just absolutely as drunk as they wanted. He had an open bar party for 180 days. And at the conclusion of this party, he's showing off and he says, I want the queen to come in. This is queen. His wife's name is Vashti. I want her to come in. I want to show her off to everybody. And oh, by the way, tell her to bring her crown in. So all of my filthy fellow men in this Persian Empire can all see how beautiful my wife is. So you can all stare at her. Well, she says, I don't think so. That doesn't sound fun to me at all. It's a huge no from Queen Vashti. So Queen says, you go back and tell him I'm not doing that. He's not going to parade me around and show everybody what I look like. That's okay. I tell him it's a no from me. So she declines. Well, in chapter 1, his assistants come up to him and say, sir, she says no. He's like, what do you mean she says no? He's not used to being told no. But she says no. He goes, well, this is a plot twist. Nobody says no to me. And they said, sir, you do realize that Queen Vashti could really empower the women of the Persian Empire to believe that you can say no to their husbands. And sir, we can't have that. And so what do you think we should do? And he says, I mean, we can't let this happen. So he says, I'll tell you what, I'm going to make a new decree that says you have to honor your husband. And she didn't, so she's out. So Queen Vashti is deposed. She's taken out of office. Well, what do we do now? Chapter 2. The king then holds a 12-month beauty contest. We got to replace her, and we're going to replace her with somebody who doesn't say no. So I'll tell you what, we're going to take every woman of this whole area, and they're going to go through beauty school. They're going to learn how to be beautiful. They're going to learn how to conduct themselves. And most of all, learn how to not only be beautiful, but always say yes to the king. It's going to be about a 12-month process. And we're going to find the best of the best. Well, Esther, she wins this contest. Esther is considered to be the most beautiful woman in the Persian Empire. Now, I will tell you something here that we don't know in the story yet. Well, we know it in the story, but the king doesn't know it yet. And that is that Esther, she's Jewish. Now, let's pause for a second. Why is she in the Persian Empire? Remember when we were going through Ezra and Nehemiah, and I let you know that there was different waves of people going back to rebuild Jerusalem? Esther's family was one of those families that did not go back. She stayed. In the Babylonian Empire. You say, how do we get to the Persian Empire? Do you remember the image in Daniel chapter 2? The head of gold was Babylon. And then who overtook Babylon? The Medo-Persian Empire. We're in that section in Daniel 2 in our timeline. The Persian Empire has now taken over the Babylonian Empire. So all those captives are now under the control of the Persian Empire. We're moving our way through the Old Testament. You see that timeline in Daniel 2. Remember the image in Daniel 2? Babylonian, Medo-Persian, Grecian, and Rome. Jesus comes on the Rome part, right? So we're in the Medo-Persian part. So now their family is taken over by the Persian Empire. This king Ahasuerus, he's over 127 provinces, and Esther wins this contest. She has Jewish lineage, but nobody knows it. So her cousin, yes, her cousin, which is in chapter 3, many people say her uncle. That's not correct. I think it does depend on your manuscript you're reading out of. There does seem to be a discrepancy there. I think the Latin Vulgate says uncle. But if you read chapter 3, it's clear that these are first cousins according to the Bible you have in your hand. So I'm going to say several times right here her cousin Mordecai, because you've probably heard your whole life her uncle Mordecai. But it does say in chapter 3 it's her cousin, so I'm very specific about that. But her cousin Mordecai finds out something. Let me just tell you here what happens in chapter 2. Mordecai overhears some men talking about how much they hate the king. Mordecai hears that, and they're going to go kill the king. Mordecai, her cousin, finds that out, and he reveals this plot to the king. Somebody passes it on. And so Ahasuerus kills those men. So his life is saved. Somebody heard about it. He kills those men. And then he has that information written down in a book. Ahasuerus keeps a book about his own life. It's a huge journal. That's the official king's book. And so he has that written down in a book. That'll be important later. Chapter 3, there's a bad guy named Haman. He's going to be the antagonist the rest of the story. Haman receives a huge promotion. He's basically second to the king in command. So, and those in the kingdom would bow down to him. Now we have a little bit of a callback to the story of Daniel, because Mordecai, remember Mordecai, although you and I know this is Esther's cousin, so he's Jewish. His Jewishness is not real popular or really famous at this point, although he has told some men at the gate of the city, which, as you know, is the council place. But he wouldn't bow down to Haman. Haman got this promotion. Everybody's bowing down to him, congratulating him. Mordecai wouldn't bow down. Well, guess what? Haman found out why he wouldn't bow down, because he was a Jew. And so he decided he wanted to kill Mordecai. Better yet, not just Mordecai, he wants to kill all the Jews. He hates the Jews. He sees them as people now that will not bow down and be a good citizen in the Persian Empire, specifically to him. So he wants to kill all the Jews. So he talks the king into this idea in chapter 3. And he says, King Ahasuerus, Xerxes the first, he says, I think that we should have this idea of we should just legalize, we should have hunting season open on all Jews. Men, women, children, doesn't matter. It's a genocide. Let's wipe them out. 127 provinces. The king appears to be, I think, somewhat confused and says, okay, great. You're second in command. Write up the law yourself. Here's the king's signet. I'll give it to you. 127 provinces. It's now legal to kill the Jews. That's chapter 3. In chapter 4, King Ahasuerus still does not know that Queen Esther is a Jew. And her cousin Mordecai urges her to speak up or she'll eventually die too. He says something like, if you don't speak up now, you might be the last to die, but you're going to die because you're a Jew. He doesn't know that you're a Jew. See the conflict here? And so Mordecai's like, hey, this is the time. This is where that famous phrase, you were put in this position for such a time as this. That's where we get that phrase in chapter 4. So Mordecai's like, you have to speak up for our people. You're in this position. But she believes that if she goes to the king and talks to him, she's punishable by death. Because see, in these days, we learn this from chapter 4, the king had to invite you into his presence. Yes, this was his wife, this is Queen Esther, but she was not free to just walk into his presence. Isn't that crazy? So I decided to institute this rule with me and Sarah. So she now has to ask permission to, why are you laughing? Is she smiling? Okay. So, but seriously, isn't that crazy? Could you imagine if your wife has to ask permission to come into your house? The queen did not have access to the king like that. And she says in chapter 4, she says the king needs to have his scepter, his golden scepter in his hand and invite somebody into his presence. So she says to Mordecai, I can't just walk in there. That's punishable by death. She finally makes a resolve in herself in chapter 4 and says, I'm going to go in the king's presence. If I die, I die. So Esther agrees. That's chapter 4. Chapter 5. Esther goes into the inner court of the king and the king sees her from his throne. So he could either at this point have her killed or say hello. Thankfully, he holds out his scepter and says, oh, let me get my scepter so you can come in. She's already in. Oh, here's my scepter. Come on in. And he's happy to see her. So he says to her, I want to give you whatever you want, up to half the kingdom. It's yours. You tell me what you want. I'm so happy to see you. So she has great favor in his sight. And she says, I'll tell you what I would like. But first, I'd like to throw you a banquet. And at the banquet, I'll tell you what I want. He says, whatever your request is, up to half the kingdom. Let's have a banquet first. You can tell me there. She says, King, I'd like to be able to honor you and your second in command, Haman. Love to honor you at a banquet that I put on. And then at this banquet, I'll tell you what's going on. Now, she wasn't trying to honor Haman. Haman's trying to kill her and her family and all the Jews. But the king agrees and says a banquet sounds fun. So Haman was happy. He was at this banquet until he looks over, and who does he see? He sees Mordecai, the queen's cousin. So when he sees Mordecai, he's not having so much fun at this banquet anymore. He recognizes that's the Jew that won't bow down to me. And so he becomes angry. He leaves out of the banquet and he goes and tells his wife what he saw. I saw this guy at the banquet. He's the one guy that won't bow down to me. We've already passed a decree to kill the Jews. I got the king. Remember, I have the king's signet right here, and I'm the one that made this law. And this guy's at the banquet that's for me to honor me and the king, and Mordecai's there. And his wife says, I got an idea. I got an idea that will shut these people up. He says, what does it tell me? And so she says, why don't you make a giant stake? Let's say, 75 feet tall. One pole that goes up to the heavens. And then in the morning, why don't you make Mordecai a shish kebab? Why don't you skewer Mordecai? Impale him with this pole. And Haman thought, man, that's why I married you. Brilliant idea. I mean, this is so brilliant. Please Haman to hear this idea. So Haman ordered that the pole would be set up outside the palace. It'll make a show of Mordecai and the other Jews. That's chapter 5. Chapter 6. So that very night, so they're out building the pole. They're out in the background with their hammers. They're sawing away, zoop, zoop, zoop. There's a pole being built right now. Now the king's in his palace, and would you believe it? He got insomnia. Couldn't sleep. Now, as he couldn't sleep, he called over for his attendant. And he says to the attendant, I'm having trouble sleeping. Would you read to me? Oh, I don't know, maybe the official history of the king. He wants to hear about himself. Because, that's going to help put him to sleep, apparently. So if you ever want to read the official acts of Ahasuerus, maybe it'll help you with your insomnia. I don't know. It didn't seem to help him because he didn't go to sleep in the story. But he says, I'm having trouble sleeping. Bring over my royal book about myself and read me of all the acts that I've done. That'll help my insomnia. This is the modern day equivalent, I guess, of, going through channel surfing. So the attendant comes over and begins reading to him. And they happen to open up to the part where Mordecai saved his life. I told you, this is an amazing story. So he says, there's a man named Mordecai. He reveals to the king that there's a plot against his life. And the king says, wait a second. Follow-up question. How did we ever reward that guy? And the attendant looks through, just a second, sir. And they said, sir, we've never done anything to reward him. The king says, well, this cannot be. This cannot be. We need to figure out how to reward this guy. So he's having this conversation with his attendant, and would you believe it? About that time, Haman walks in, not knowing the subject matter. So the king brings him in, and the king asks the attendant, what should I do to honor these men who please me so much? Haman thinks he's talking about him. I mean, this is the greatest story ever, right? This is filled with plot twists. Haman's like, oh, did I enter this room at the right time? He's asking how he's going to honor people like me. Who's more worthy than me? The king is up at night trying to figure out how to honor me. So he says, oh, I can answer that question, sir. So Mordecai assumes he's speaking to Mordecai, but Haman assumes it's about him. So Haman tells him about all these lofty ideas. Sir, I can tell you what it is, sir. You should bring out your royal horse, sir, and you should wrap your royal robe around this man. I mean, whoever it might be, and put your ring on this man and parade him around town, king, and have around the palace, and maybe everybody could come out and cheer him on and say, well done. And the king says, wow, that's pretty good. He says, I like those ideas. And Haman's going, well, I thought of it, so it should be pretty good. The king says, we're going to do that. And then he turns to his attendant and says, go get me Mordecai. Haman's like, time out. Why do we need Mordecai? You mean the guy that was at the banquet? Oh, I have something ready for him. Do you hear the construction in the background? Yeah, that's for him. I have something planned. But you're asking me how to honor people and then all this. So why are we getting Mordecai again? That's how chapter 6 ends. Chapter 7. Oh, chapter 6 continued. So at this point, Haman now has to, can you believe this? Escort Mordecai around the palace on the king's horse. So Haman is now leading the horse, and everybody's cheering for Mordecai. He's going, oh, what a great idea this was. I didn't know he was talking about him. And now Haman is now making this parade route happen. The people are going like this to Mordecai, and he's, oh, thank you. And he's got the king's robe on and going around on the horse. And Haman's like, boy, I thought he was talking about me, But now he's escorting around Mordecai. Puts on his best robe, people cheer for him, and Haman is not too excited about this. So now Haman is taken to the banquet that Esther's prepared. Now, chapter 7. During the banquet, the king finally asks Esther what her request was. Remember, she said, I'll tell you at the banquet. Then she reveals this request and says that her people might be spared. And the king says, well, my queen, my wife, who's trying to hurt you? And here he acts like, I don't even know what you're talking about. And the queen says, well, it was Haman that did this. You gave him your signet. You made it law. You made it decree. Haman made it to where we're being hunted right now in all 127 provinces in the Persian Empire. that she said this in front of Haman. He's sitting there eating at the banquet, and she said, well, that guy right there. Now, can you imagine the courage it took Esther to say that? At this point, you're either a dead woman or a hero, and you don't know which one yet. But she looked the devil right in the face and said, that guy did it. Remember when he took your ring? That guy did it. That's the plan right there. Haman grows pale. Right before the king, he's fearful. He's being called out. The best antidote to darkness is light, right? Now, the king storms out of the room in total anger. Now, get this as a plot reversal. Haman stays behind at the banquet and begins pleading for his life from Queen Esther. Please don't kill me. She's going, oh, well, this is a great reversal, isn't it? Now, the king returned, and Haman's face is covered as if to say, this one's about to be executed. So the king comes in, covers Haman's face. Then one of the attendants, after his execution has been signaled, one of the attendants told the king, said, oh, sir, just out of convenience, just so you know, we have just prepared a 75-foot pole outside for an execution. I mean, just, in case you're interested, we're ready for an execution. Just outside, freshly built. Oh, king, you ought to see it. Oh, it's glorious, 75 feet tall. And so the king says, wow, that is convenient. How unfortunate for Haman. Haman was impaled on the very same pole that he had put up to kill Mordecai. Great idea, wife, That's how chapter 7 ends. Here's chapter 8. The king then makes a decree to help the Jews. He takes that ring that he had given to Haman, his signet, to make things official. He takes that ring from from Haman, and he gives it to Mordecai. Now, Esther says, I need you to help me because we need to protect ourselves. See, there's already been a decree that we're fair game, that we're to be hunted. It's gone out to all 127 provinces of people are hunting us. We need to reverse this. And the king goes, well, I can't reverse a decree, but I'll tell you, why don't you guys write something up and you can use my ring to make it official throughout the land. So Esther appoints her cousin Mordecai to be in charge of Haman's property. Isn't that beautiful? And so Esther then writes something with Mordecai to write a new law for the Jews to not be annihilated. All 127 provinces receive this new law in their own languages. It basically shows that the Jews were allowed to congregate together in one place. That was legal now. And they're allowed to fight back with whomever wanted to harm them. So we can't reverse the first decree. How silly is that, right? Can't reverse that. But now the Jews are now legally allowed to fight it out and defend themselves. Now, because people were so surprised at the reversal of this decision and that God was obviously in favor of the Jews, that the Bible says at the end of chapter 8 that many in the land, please get this, it's so foundational for our covenantal story, many in the land became Jews. They just became Jews. You say, well, Ken, how could that be? Because the term Jew or Israelite, this was never an ethnic designation. It was always a covenantal designation done by obedience. These Gentiles heard the story and became Jews. That's exactly what it says at the end of Esther chapter 8. A miracle is taking place in the land. Chapter 9, the Jews' enemies still tried to overpower them. Remember, it's still legal. They're still fair game to be hunted. The same decree the same day this decree came out, they could defend themselves. People tried to overpower them and said, we need to hurry and take them out before they can organize. Well, it didn't work out so well because the Jews overpowered them. And also the governors of the different provinces, they all began to help the Jews because they feared Mordecai. When they got word that Mordecai took over for Haman, they're like, whoa, politically, this started to not make sense here. So they started to defend the Jews because they were fearing Mordecai. Now in Shushan, which is the capital of the Persian Empire, these Jews came and killed 500 people who tried to kill them. And they also took 10 sons of Haman and killed them just in the same manner their father was killed on the 75-foot pole. Now, in total, we record about 75,000 people the Jews killed who first wanted them dead throughout this entire Roman Empire, or Persian Empire, excuse me. Now, the day after they completed that 75,000 person slaughter, they rested after that day. Now, that day that they rested became known as the Feast of Purim. Now, Purim is a Persian word. If you would, in your Bibles, go to Esther chapter 3 and verse 7. I'll show you where that was. This is going back in the story when Haman wanted to kill the Jews. And they said, "Sir, when should we go and kill all the Jews?" And Haman said, "Oh, bring me over my royal dice. Let's play a game. What day should we kill the Jews? Well, let's see here." And he took his dice and he throws the dice and he says, "And their death shall be on," and he looks at a date on the calendar and his royal dice. He's playing a game with their lives. The Bible says he's casting lots. He's throwing this pebble. They're little rocks. In our mind, think dice. He's just picking a number with their lives. And so he's casting lots. That word in the Persian language, lot, is pronounced pur, P-U-R, as we would say. And so this rest day, they called it as the lot or the portion. And so they're mocking and rejoicing that the casting of the lots from chapter 3 and verse 7 didn't come to pass. So Purim is basically the feast of lots, feast of casting lots, because it didn't come to pass. Ahasuerus then made this an annual 2-day feast, and that's the month Adar in the Hebrew lunar calendar, Adar 14 and 15. There's one small chapter with 3 verses, I believe. King Ahasuerus then spoke of the greatness of Mordecai by recording his story in, you guessed it, the official book of his reign. Remember the book that he's been reading on during his insomnia. Mordecai was second in command throughout the Persian Empire. He continued to protect and provide for his people and their descendants. Now, the plot line of Esther is very complicated, but when you hear it in just a fun story form like that, hopefully you got a lot of the details. Now, next time we get together, I'm going to show you and make the case of how Ezekiel, in Ezekiel 38 and 39, tells about a prophecy that I believe Esther fulfills, and it's what we famously call Gog and Magog, which follows Ezekiel 37, which is the prophecy that they will go back to their land. See, chronologically, the people go back to their land, not all of them, and that's the dry bones passage. They're brought back into their land, but not all of them. 38 and 39 pick up. The scene then switches over, I believe, to the book of Esther, and I will show you some very specific things that I believe are compelling to show you that Gog and Magog happened and was fulfilled in the days of Esther. All right, we'll get back to that a little bit next Sunday, Lord willing.